first talk.
Okay, my name is Edward Pappert, and today I'll be talking about the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder on the HPA axis. So post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, is a chronic stress-related disorder that develops after following a traumatic event. That is the #1 criteria for diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. It must follow a traumatic event. The most common types of events or causes that result in post-traumatic stress disorder is combat. It's often seen in war veterans coming home from combat, domestic abuse, rape, natural disasters, and other physical accidents such as car accidents and so on. There are 4 main categories or clusters of symptoms that are associated with PTSD, and these are the primary criteria used to diagnose. A specific amount of these 4 need to be present for a 4-month or greater period to be diagnosed with PTSD. These are reliving the event either through nightmares or flashbacks, avoiding reminders of the event, hyperarousal, and then negative alterations in mood and cognition. PTSD is a heterogeneous condition. So not everyone with PTSD will develop the same symptoms. Someone might have completely different symptoms than someone else, even though they both have PTSD. Also, people vary in their susceptibility to develop PTSD. So for example, 2 people could be in a car accident, and one of them might go on to develop PTSD while the other one might be completely fine. Due to this complex and variability from person to person, it is very hard to diagnose, and because of this, it is often underdiagnosed and undertreated. So the annual cost to Society of Anxiety Disorders such as PTSD, major depression, and so on is around $42 billion a year. That's due to medical costs, prescription drug costs, workplace costs, and so on. Around 8% of adults in the United States will develop post-traumatic stress disorder at some point in their lives, and it is 2 times more common in females than it is in males. So around 1 in 10 women in the United States will develop PTSD. This is mostly due to women being often more involved in domestic abuse and rape cases, but I also read some studies that showed that women in combat are still more likely than men to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, there's not an actual correlation that children are more likely to develop PTSD than an adult, but I did see a lot of studies that showed that children who have traumatic events such as peer rejection, bullying, or bad parenting are more inclined to develop post-traumatic stress disorder down the road as an adult compared to those who did not experience it. So the hypothalamic pituitary gland adrenal axis, otherwise known as the HPA axis, I know we've all learned about this, so I'm not going to cover it extensively, but it's a key part of the neuroendocrine system that controls the reactions to stress, and it does this mainly through the actions of the glucocorticoid hormone cortisol. Cortisol has many key functions in the body. It with epinephrine are the main hormones involved in the fight and flight response. It induces gluconeogenesis to provide glucose for the body. It inhibits protein synthesis in muscles to provide amino acids. It reduces bone formation. So it's pretty obvious to see that chronic or abnormal elevated or lower levels of cortisol can have many bad effects within the body. The HPA axis also regulates many other processes in the body, such as digestion, energy use and expenditure, circadian rhythms, arousal, and immune system function. Here is a diagram of the HPA axis negative feedback loop. This is the primary way that the HPA axis regulates cortisol, its secretion and levels. So quickly to go through it, CRH, otherwise known as corticotropin releasing hormone, is going to be released from the hypothalamus in response to a stressor stimuli. That is going to go down and stimulate the pituitary gland to release ACTH, otherwise known as adrenal corticotropic hormone. And then that is going to go down to act on the adrenal glands to release the glucocorticoid cortisol, as well as some other mineralocorticoids and other steroid hormones. Cortisol is then going to go and carry out the functions I previously just described. After it's done carrying out its functions, or its levels get too high, it's going to go back and react with glucocorticoid receptors within the pituitary gland and hypothalamus and cause them to stop making CRH and ACTH, and then that is going to result in the cortisol levels dropping back to normal. This is a key function, so any abnormalities within this have many, many different effects within the body. So throughout my studies, I found 3 key bodies of evidence that showed the effects that PTSD has on the HPA axis. The first, there are abnormal hormone levels within the HPA axis seen in PTSD patients. The second, there are alterations in the sensitivity as well as the number of glucocorticoid receptors within the negative feedback loop of the HPA axis in HPA and PTSD patients. And finally, there are abnormalities within the processes that are regulated by the HPA axis in PTSD patients. So the first one, abnormal hormone levels seen in PTSD. A study by Baker and colleagues found that mean cerebrospinal fluid concentrations of CRH were actually higher within PTSD patients compared to non-PTSD patients, 55 in PTSD to 42 in non-PTSD. So based off this, you would assume if there's higher CRH levels, then you're probably going to assume that there's going to be higher ACTH levels as well as cortisol. However, this is one of the main paradoxes seen in PTSD. Many studies have proven that there's actually an abnormally low level of cortisol seen in PTSD patients. This is a strong indicator that the abnormality caused by PTSD is somewhere within the HPA axis and not within the brain, primarily probably somewhere within the negative feedback loop, leading us to our second key point, altered sensitivity within the HPA axis negative feedback loop. So Yehuda and colleagues have done a multiple amount of studies. One of the studies they conducted used DST or dexamethasone suppression test, and the results of this showed that there was an enhanced negative feedback inhibition within PTSD patients. It also found that there was an increased number of glucocorticoid receptors in the pituitary gland as well as the sensitivity of them, further showing that there was most likely an enhanced negative feedback system. They also ran another test when they tested the ACTH as well as cortisol levels in a PTSD group and a non-PTSD group before and after they were given an exogenous cortisol injection. What they found was the PTSD group had a greater decline in cortisol and ACTH compared to the non-PTSD group. And finally, they conducted a test using metirapone, which tested the activity of the pituitary gland as well as the release of ACTH in the absence of the negative feedback. And what they found was that people with PTSD had a much higher pituitary gland activity and ACTH release. And what this showed is that the pituitary gland and release of ACTH is working hyperactively within PTSD patients compared to non-PTSD patients, which further shows that there is an enhanced negative feedback system within PTSD. And the third point, altered processes regulated by HPA axis seen in PTSD. There's many, but I focus on altered circadian rhythms and altered immune system. So altered circadian rhythms, one study conducted by Yehuda showed that there was a more dynamic range of cortisol over the diurnal cycle within PTSD patients. Cortisol mostly is highest in the morning and then gets lower throughout the day and is lowest at night, and it's believed to be key in the process of waking up in the morning and the alertness. And it's different in PTSD patients. It's randomly raised and it's not necessarily higher in the morning, and it's just different throughout the day than it would be in a normal response. This diagram right here just shows the close link between the circadian clock and the stress response system or the HPA axis of the body. There's also a study I found that showed that cortisol acts as a key secondary messenger between peripheral and central biological clocks, and is key in the synchronization of the circadian rhythm. So any alterations to the levels of cortisol would alter circadian rhythm. And then the altered immune system. A study I found showed that there was a higher circulating levels of T lymphocytes within PTSD patients, putting them at a higher risk of developing autoimmune diseases, and also due to the key anti-inflammatory function of cortisol, and due to there being lower levels of cortisol within PTSD patients, PTSD patients tend to have a higher chance of developing inflammatory diseases due to low levels of cortisol. So moving forward, based on these three key pieces of evidence I just provided, it's pretty obvious to see that HPA axis, rather than the brain and other parts of the body, is most likely the primary system of the body that is altered most by PTSD. Better understanding exactly what happens to the HPA axis, how these alterations result in the symptoms we see in PTSD, as well as studying other similar stress-related mental disorders, is key to reduce the billions of dollars cost each year, as well as to help improve on the amount of misdiagnosis and undertreatments. Thank you.
Questions for Edward?
So I know you were saying it's underdiagnosed because it's pretty hard to, based on those 4 criteria, like effectively diagnose somebody with PTSD. So for those studies, it seems like there were a lot of them, a lot of people examining PTSD patients. what type of criteria, like how did they decide who was and wasn't diagnosed with PTSD?
So they never specifically went over the criteria, but they always said that they were clinically diagnosed with PTSD. So these patients they used were mostly always war veterans that were previously clinically diagnosed. And for those diagnoses, they used the DSM-5 criteria, which are pretty much based off they had a traumatic event, and it's based off those 4 criteria mainly. They were always clinically diagnosed previously.
Did I understand you correctly that that one of the outcomes of this hypersensitization of the HPA axis is generally low circulating glucocorticoid levels?
Yes, low levels of cortisol.
Cortisol?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the paradoxes that was found.
Right.
High CRH, low cortisol.
And another question is, so there are therapies, I think behavioral therapies and stuff for PTSD that, from what I understand, are successful to some degree. In patients where there's been a successful treatment of PTSD, do these characteristics of the HPA axis that you outlined here, do they change? Do they go back to normal?
I didn't focus on a lot of studies, but what I did read that they didn't necessarily go back to normal. A lot of the therapies are psychotherapy, so they would either talk about the event straight up with the person. They also give antidepressants. So a lot of the symptoms of PTSD are very similar to depression and acute stress disorder and other panic disorders. So the antidepressants will help some part of it, but they still always have different alterations. Even though they improve on some of the symptoms, they're mostly not fully better.
Yeah, it's just interesting whether or not the malfunction of the HPA axis is correctable.
Yeah, I don't think it's fully corrected at any point, but I think it can be improved upon.
Is there like a correlation between like the time after an event, the time that passes, and
yeah, a lot of studies actually looked at that. Most of the studies show that it's hard to diagnose at first, so a lot of people don't undertreat it and misdiagnose at first because they don't think it's PTSD, because it's a chronic disorder. So before 4 months of having it, they don't diagnose it with PTSD. They call it acute disorder or a different type of depression or something else. So a lot of people aren't treated right away when they should be. So there's not a ton of studies showing how early treatment would help, but it's shown that if you treat it right away, you will have better improved symptoms opposed to waiting.
The cortisol levels are low throughout the whole day, like as soon as you wake up?
No, in PTSD?
Yeah.
No, they're high a lot. You're hyper-aroused, so they're higher throughout the range.
They'll wake up in the middle of the night from like a nightmare.
Yeah, they have intense dreaming flashbacks when you randomly get aroused, so it's just higher range throughout the day.
Okay.
In general, would you say that the treatments are pretty successful, or do you think there's a higher relapse rate?
There's probably a high. I mean, they're somewhat successful if you can catch it early, but it's really hard to diagnose early because there's so many other the symptoms fit so many other criteria of other diseases. So the psychotherapy, from what I looked at, seemed pretty successful, but nothing is that perfect. Like, probably more relapse than.
Still relapse.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.